The Whisper on Maple Street, 1,500 words. Maple Street had always been a haven of quietude and order, a street where children's laughter mingled with the hum of lawnmowers and the soft rustle of wind through well-maintained trees. It was the kind of neighborhood where time seemed to move slowly, and nothing ever really changed. That is, until the sleek, black cars started appearing every night. Miriam Watson, a 72-year-old widow, had been a part of this community for over 4 decades. She had witnessed the comings and goings of families, the rise of new homes, and the slow departure of older residents, leaving behind memories and the essence of life well lived. After her husband had passed 3 years ago, Miriam had filled the quiet void of her life by sitting at her living room window, watching the world unfold on Maple Street. It gave her a sense of comfort, of still being part of something even when loneliness crept in. But now, something was amiss, and her keen eyes had caught on to it. For the past several weeks, Miriam had noticed a strange pattern, one that had now become a nightly ritual. As the sun set and the sky turned a deep shade of purple, a vintage black car would cruise down Maple Street. Its presence was an oddity in itself, the sleek machine looking far too grand to belong to any of the modest homes in the area. Behind the wheel sat a man who exuded wealth and sophistication, James Harrow, a figure known throughout the city as a millionaire businessman. Miriam remembered the occasional article in the local paper about his charitable works, his face often plastered next to headlines that praised his generosity. Yet here he was, night after night, slipping into a decaying garage at the end of the street with a small girl by his side. It wasn't just James that piqued Miriam's curiosity. The young girl who accompanied him seemed out of place in the picture, her bright yellow dress a stark contrast to the faded and crumbling structure that they would disappear into. The girl, no older than 7 or 8, had dark eyes that seemed to hold far too much weight for someone her age. Her demeanor was quiet, almost withdrawn, and it stirred something deep in Miriam's heart. As the days passed, Miriam's concern grew into a knot of unease. What could James, a man known for his opulence and business acumen, be doing in such a dilapidated place? Why was he with a little girl in a setting that screamed secrecy? These questions gnawed at Miriam, each one more troubling than the last. She began spending even more time at her window, the hours slipping by as she watched the black car roll down the street and vanish into the garage without a word. One evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood, Miriam decided she could no longer sit idly by. Her old bones protested as she rose from her armchair, but her determination was far stronger. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she stepped out onto her front porch, the cool breeze brushing against her cheeks. As she made her way toward the end of the street, her steps slow but steady, she felt a strange sensation in the pit of her stomach, part curiosity, part fear. She knew she had to get closer, to see for herself what was happening in that garage. The shadows seemed to grow longer as she approached, and the once welcoming trees of Maple Street now looked like dark sentinels watching her every move. Her heart pounded in her chest as she neared the garage. From her vantage point, she could see the old rusted door slightly ajar, as if it were waiting for her to make the next move. Miriam stopped a few feet away, crouching behind a large oak tree for cover. Her breath was shallow, her nerves frayed, but she was determined to see something, anything, that would explain the bizarre situation. As she peeked around the tree, she saw James step out of the car, his suit as sharp as ever, though his face seemed tired, almost worn. He walked to the other side of the car and gently helped the young girl out, his hand protectively guiding her towards the garage. "Amara," Miriam whispered, remembering the girl's name from a conversation she had overheard weeks ago at the grocery store. The girl's face was etched with something that Miriam couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear, but there was a sadness there, a heaviness in her young eyes that made Miriam's heart ache. James ushered the girl inside, glancing around the street with a quick, cautious look before disappearing into the darkened garage. The door creaked shut behind them, and once again, All was still. But Miriam wasn't satisfied with just watching anymore. She needed answers. The old woman lingered for a few more moments, her mind racing with possibilities. What was going on in there? Was Amara in danger? Was James hiding something far more sinister than anyone could imagine? Her suspicions deepened as she retreated to her home that night. What if something terrible was happening behind that closed garage door? Miriam's heart raced at the thought. James Harrow had always been a man of stature, a respected figure in the community. But people could change. Wealth could corrupt. And secrets, especially ones that involved vulnerable children, had a way of festering in the shadows. The following day, Miriam couldn't shake the images from her mind. She tried to focus on her usual routines, knitting by the window, sipping tea as the late afternoon sun streamed through the curtains, but her thoughts kept returning to the garage. What could be happening in there? She had to find out. That night, when the black car arrived as usual, Miriam was ready. She had concocted a plan, something that would give her the chance to see what was inside that garage without drawing too much attention. As James and Amara entered the garage, Miriam made her move. Slipping out of her front door, she crept closer, moving silently in the cover of darkness. This time, she would see for herself what was going on. As Miriam neared the garage, her heart pounding in her chest, she noticed a faint glow of light seeping through the cracks of the old wooden door. Her breath caught in her throat. What could they be doing in there? Was this some twisted game, or something far worse? Just as she was about to inch closer to the door, a sound broke through the silence. The faint, melodic hum of a piano, its soft notes drifting out from the garage and into the cool night air. Miriam froze, her heart skipping a beat. A piano? She hadn't expected that. She had expected something far more sinister. But why a piano? Her curiosity was now stronger than her fear. Something inside the garage was different than what she had imagined. But what? She had to know. The truth, however, would be more than Miriam could ever prepare herself for. An answer that would unravel a mystery far deeper than she had ever imagined and challenge everything she thought she knew about James Harrow and the little girl in the yellow dress. A melody in the darkness. 1,500 words. Miriam stood frozen, the delicate melody from the piano dancing through the night air. The notes were soft, hesitant at first, as though whoever was playing was searching for the right keys, the right rhythm. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a tune she didn't recognize, yet there was something deeply haunting about it. Something that pulled at the corners of her memories, evoking emotions she hadn't felt in years. For a moment, Miriam forgot the suspicions that had consumed her over the past few weeks. All she could focus on was the gentle sound of the music coming from the dilapidated garage. The garage she had feared housed dark secrets, now seemed to be hiding something else. Something tender, something fragile. But as quickly as the melody began, it faltered. The notes stumbled awkwardly, and then there was silence. Miriam strained her ears, her heart pounding in her chest, as the night returned to its usual stillness. She waited, her eyes fixed on the rusted door, but nothing stirred inside. The light remained on, casting a faint glow from within. But there were no more sounds. No voices, no movement. Just stillness. Her mind raced. What was going on in there? The juxtaposition between the eerie silence and the peaceful music moments earlier left her even more baffled. Was this all part of a ruse? Was the piano meant to distract from something far more sinister? Miriam had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving, and James Harrow's impeccable reputation in the community didn't dispel the gnawing feeling in her gut. Determined to find answers, she knew she couldn't linger outside the garage any longer. James was cautious, always scanning the area before entering, and if he spotted her, it could ruin everything. She hurried back to her house, her mind swirling with thoughts as she closed the door behind her. Locking it, she pressed her back against the wooden frame, trying to steady her breathing. She felt like she had just peered into something private, something she wasn't meant to see. The mystery of the music tugged at her thoughts. Who was playing the piano? Was it James? Or was it Amara, the young girl who seemed too quiet, too withdrawn? The way the melody had stumbled, the way it had stopped so abruptly, it felt as though the person playing was learning, struggling with something new. Miriam felt a strange pang in her chest. If Amara was learning the piano, then perhaps there was more to this story than she had assumed. Perhaps this wasn't the dark, dangerous secret she had feared. But why the secrecy? Why hide it in a decaying garage at the end of the street? Miriam's nights became sleepless as the questions gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the image of James and Amara in the garage, sitting together in the shadows as the piano keys whispered their melody. Why would a man like James, a millionaire who could afford the finest instruments and tutors, take his young companion to such a rundown place to play the piano? It didn't add up. The following morning, Miriam decided to confide in someone. She needed to talk it out, to see if she was blowing things out of proportion. Over tea, she invited Debbie, her neighbor and friend for over 20 years, to her home. Debbie was known for her gossip, but she was also level-headed. If anyone could offer perspective, it was her. "So let me get this straight," Debbie said, stirring sugar into her tea as she sat at Miriam's kitchen table. "James Harrow has been coming to the old garage every night with that little girl, and you heard a piano playing inside last night." Miriam nodded, feeling a little ridiculous now that she said it aloud. Debbie raised an eyebrow. "A piano? Are you sure? I didn't think there was anything left in that old place besides rats and cobwebs." "I know how it sounds," Miriam replied, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. "But I'm telling you, I heard it. And it wasn't just any piano. It was like someone was learning. A child, maybe." Debbie took a sip of her tea, her eyes narrowing as she considered the story. "So, what do you think? That James is hiding this girl away in the garage to teach her piano in secret. Why would he do that when he could afford the best teachers, the best instruments? Doesn't make sense." "That's exactly what I've been wondering," Miriam said. "It doesn't add up. Why would they go to that rundown place every night? Why keep it hidden?" Debbie leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Maybe it's not what you think. Maybe James is just trying to give the girl some space, away from the public eye. You know how the press can be with people like him, always digging into their personal lives." Miriam considered this. It was possible, but it didn't explain everything. The secrecy, the late-night visits, the abandoned garage, it all felt too strange. But why the garage? Why that place? Debbie shrugged. "Maybe it has sentimental value. Who knows? Rich people can be weird about stuff like that." Miriam wasn't convinced, but she nodded along, not wanting to push the conversation further. Debbie's skepticism was understandable. On the surface, the whole situation seemed harmless, odd but not sinister. And yet Miriam's gut told her there was more to it than met the eye. That night, Miriam found herself once again at her window, watching as the black car rolled down the street. She had to admit, there was something elegant about the way it moved, like a sleek predator prowling the darkened street. James stepped out, his figure sharp against the gloom, and opened the door for Amara. The girl, in her usual yellow dress, climbed out without a word, her eyes downcast as always. Miriam watched closely as they entered the garage. The light flickered on, illuminating the worn structure from within. And then, nothing. No piano, no movement. Just silence. Frustration gnawed at her. How could she get closer without being seen? She needed to know what was happening inside that garage, but it seemed impossible to get near without raising suspicion. As the hours ticked by, Miriam's mind wandered back to the piano, to the music that had stirred something deep within her. There was a story there, one she couldn't quite grasp yet. The next morning, as Miriam pondered her next move, something unexpected happened. There was a knock at her door. Miriam's heart skipped a beat as she opened it. Standing on her porch was a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with long dark hair and bright eyes, filled with determination. She wore a simple, unassuming outfit, but there was something about her presence that caught Miriam off guard. "Mrs. Watson?" the young woman asked, her voice soft but clear. Miriam nodded, her curiosity piqued. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" The woman hesitated for a moment, then glanced down the street as if to make sure no one else was listening. "I need to talk to you. It's about James Harrow." Miriam's pulse quickened. She stepped aside, allowing the woman inside. Her mind raced with possibilities. Had she been wrong all along? Was this woman connected to the mystery? As they sat down at the kitchen table, the young woman introduced herself. "My name is Lila, and I work for James Harrow. I've been with his family for years. But something's changed, and I don't know who else to turn to. I've seen you watching. I know you've noticed things." Miriam's heart pounded. Lila's words confirmed her suspicions. There was something going on with James. Something that went beyond simple piano lessons in an old garage. Layla's voice wavered as she spoke. "It's about the girl. Amara. There's something you need to know. Something James hasn't told anyone." Miriam leaned forward, her hands trembling. The truth was finally within reach, but she wasn't prepared for what came next. "What is it?" Miriam asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Layla took a deep breath, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sadness. "Amara, she's not his daughter. She's not even his family. She's someone he rescued. But he's in danger, and so is she." The room seemed to close in around Miriam as the weight of Layla's words sunk in. Everything she thought she knew about James, about Amara, was unraveling before her eyes. And the danger, whatever it was far closer than she had imagined. The secrets beneath the surface, 1,500 words. Miriam sat in stunned silence, her hands trembling as she tried to comprehend the bombshell Layla had just dropped. Amara wasn't James's daughter. The girl who had haunted Miriam's thoughts for weeks wasn't even related to him. And now, the young woman sitting across from her, eyes filled with fear and urgency, had just confirmed her worst suspicions. Something far darker was at play. "Rescued," Miriam whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do you mean? From what?" Layla glanced nervously toward the window, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of the tablecloth, a clear sign that whatever she was about to reveal was something she had kept bottled up for too long. "She's in danger," Layla began, her voice low. "James has been trying to protect her, but it's more complicated than you think. There are people who want her back, people who shouldn't be anywhere near her. She's not just a girl he rescued off the streets. She's—" Layla stopped, her words caught in her throat as she struggled to explain. Miriam leaned in closer, her mind racing with the possibilities. Could Amara be the victim of something sinister? Trafficking? Abuse? The thought sent a chill down her spine. Layla took a deep breath and continued. "James has kept this a secret from everyone, even his closest associates. He found Amara a little over a year ago, living in an abusive household. Her mother, well, let's just say she wasn't in a position to take care of her. Amara was neglected, isolated, and when James discovered the situation, he knew he had to do something." Miriam's chest tightened. She could see the pain in Layla's eyes, the kind of pain that came from knowing too much, from witnessing suffering that most people would never understand. She thought back to Amara's quiet demeanor, the shadow in the girl's eyes that had always seemed so out of place. It all made sense now. But why the secrecy? Miriam asked, her voice tinged with confusion. Why hide her away in that old garage? Why not just take her in officially, give her the life she deserves? Layla hesitated before answering. It's not that simple. James wanted to adopt her, but her biological father, he's dangerous. He has connections, powerful ones. When he found out Amara was gone, he started looking for her. James knew that if he officially adopted her, it would lead straight back to him, and her father would come after both of them. The garage, it's a safe place, somewhere out of sight where no one would think to look. At least for now. Miriam's heart sank as she realized the gravity of the situation. James wasn't hiding Amara for nefarious reasons. He was protecting her from a man who would do unspeakable harm. The garage, with its dilapidated exterior and rusted door, was a shield, a place where they could remain hidden from the world's eyes. Layla's voice trembled as she continued. But it's not enough. Her father's getting closer, and James is running out of options. That's why I came to you. I've seen you watching from your window, and I know you've noticed things. We need help. We can't keep this up much longer. Miriam's mind raced, trying to process everything. The story was far more complex than she could have ever imagined. The black car, the garage, the secrecy. It all made sense now. But knowing the truth didn't ease the knot of fear growing in her stomach. If Amara's father really was as dangerous as Layla made him out to be, then James and the little girl were in more danger than ever. Have you gone to the police? Miriam asked, though she already suspected the answer. Layla shook her head. We can't. Her father has connections in law enforcement, and even if they wanted to help, they wouldn't be able to keep her safe. He's already put out feelers in the city. People are looking for her, and we can't trust anyone. James is trying to find a way out, but it's complicated. He's protecting her the only way he knows how. Miriam's pulse quickened. She had always prided herself on being the type of woman who took action, who didn't sit by when others were in need, and yet she had been powerless to help, watching from her window as the mystery of James and Amara unfolded before her eyes. But now, the stakes were far higher than she had ever anticipated. This wasn't just about curiosity or gossip. This was about life and death. Layla leaned forward, her eyes pleading. Mrs. Watson, we need someone on the outside. Someone who can keep an eye on things, who can alert us if something seems off. You've already been watching, and I think you're the only one we can trust. Miriam's heart skipped a beat. The idea of becoming involved in something so dangerous, so fraught with risk, terrified her. But as she looked into Layla's eyes, she saw the desperation there, the raw fear of someone who had nowhere else to turn. And then she thought of Amara, the little girl in the yellow dress, whose eyes held secrets too heavy for her small frame. I'll help, Miriam said, her voice stronger than she felt. But we need to be smart about this. We can't let her father get anywhere near her. Layla's face softened with relief, and for the first time since she had arrived, she allowed herself a small smile. Thank you, Mrs. Watson. I knew we could count on you. Over the next few days, Miriam's role as the silent sentinel of Maple Street became more deliberate. She spent hours by her window, not just out of habit, but with a new purpose. Every time James's car rolled down the street, her heart would race, and she would watch with bated breath as the pair disappeared into the garage. She noticed little things now. The way James scanned the street for anyone who might be watching, the tension in his shoulders as he guided Amara inside. It was clear he was living in a state of constant fear, and that fear was beginning to seep into Miriam's own heart. One evening, as she sat by her window, knitting half-forgotten in her lap, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A car, unfamiliar and out of place, was parked at the far end of the street. It wasn't one of the sleek, polished cars that the neighbors typically drove. This one was old, beaten up, its windows tinted so dark that she couldn't see inside. And it wasn't just the car that set off alarm bells. It was the way it sat there, motionless, as if waiting for something, or someone. Miriam's fingers tightened around the arm of her chair as she watched the car, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. After what felt like an eternity, the car's engine roared to life, and it slowly pulled away, disappearing into the night. The next morning, Miriam knew she had to tell Layla. There was no way this was a coincidence. Someone had been watching, waiting, and it could only mean one thing. They were getting closer. When Leela arrived at her door later that afternoon, Miriam wasted no time explaining what she had seen. It was parked there for almost an hour, she said, her voice shaking. I've never seen that car before. And I'm telling you, they were watching. Layla's face paled as she listened. We need to move quickly, she whispered. James has been preparing for this, but we didn't think it would happen so soon. I'll let him know. Miriam's heart pounded as the reality of the situation sunk in. The danger was no longer some distant threat. It was here, right on their doorstep. And now, they had to act before it was too late. That night, the tension on Maple Street was palpable. Miriam couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. As dusk fell and the familiar black car rolled down the street, she held her breath, watching James and Amara make their way to the garage. But tonight, something was different. Just as they reached the garage door, James froze. His eyes scanned the street, his posture rigid, and then he quickly ushered Amara inside. Miriam watched in horror as the same unfamiliar car from the night before crept down the street, its headlights off, moving slowly, deliberately. Before she could react, the car pulled up in front of the garage, and two men stepped out. Miriam's heart stopped. The danger had arrived. Shadows closing in, 1,500 words. Miriam's heart raced as she watched the two men step out of the unfamiliar car. They moved with a sense of purpose, their faces obscured by the dim light from the street lamps. Everything about their posture screamed danger. From her vantage point at the window, she could see the tension in their movements, the calculated way they approached the garage, their eyes scanning the area like predators hunting prey. Her breath caught in her throat. This was it. The moment she had feared was unfolding before her eyes, and there was no time to waste. She couldn't just sit by and do nothing. Without thinking, she grabbed her phone and quickly dialed Layla's number, her hands shaking as she pressed it to her ear. It rang twice before Layla's voice answered on the other end, breathless and filled with worry. Mrs. Watson, what's wrong? They're here, Miriam whispered, her voice barely a tremor. Two men, they're outside the garage. They're going after James and Amara. There was a brief pause, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. Stay where you are, Layla instructed, her voice laced with urgency. I'm on my way. Whatever you do, don't go outside. Miriam nodded, even though Layla couldn't see her. Her instincts screamed at her to do something, anything, but Layla was right. She was an elderly woman with no means to physically confront these men. All she could do was watch, and hope that help would arrive in time. The men approached the garage door, their movements deliberate and measured. Miriam could see one of them reach into his coat, pulling out a crowbar, the metal glinting in the faint light. Her stomach turned as the man jammed the crowbar into the garage door's side, prying it open with a loud creak. The sound sent chills down her spine, the noise cutting through the stillness of the night like a warning bell. They were going in. Miriam gripped the armrest of her chair, unable to tear her eyes away. Her pulse pounded in her ears as the door swung open wider, revealing the faint glow of light inside the garage. She couldn't see James or Amara from her angle, but she knew they were in there, hiding, vulnerable, unaware of the threat that was about to descend upon them. The two men exchanged a glance before one of them stepped inside, his tall frame disappearing into the shadows. The second man lingered at the entrance, keeping watch. Miriam's hands trembled as she gripped her phone tighter, wondering if she should call the police. But what if it was too late? What if they had connections that would render the authorities useless, as Layla had warned? Her mind spun with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Suddenly, a muffled crash echoed from within the garage. Miriam's heart leaped into her throat. She strained to see through the narrow gap in the door, but the angle of the street made it impossible. For several long moments, there was silence, an unbearable, suffocating stillness. And then, voices. Low, hurried voices. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of confrontation. Miriam's breath hitched as she realized what must be happening. James had been found. The men were inside, and the worst-case scenario was unfolding right before her eyes. She felt powerless, trapped by her own fear and limitations. A shadow moved near the door, and then one of the men emerged, dragging James by the collar of his shirt. Miriam gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she watched in horror. James's face was bruised, blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow. His hands were bound, and his expression was one of quiet defiance, though Miriam could see the pain etched into his features. The second man followed close behind, his grip tight on Amara's arm. The girl's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She didn't cry or scream, but there was a silent plea in her gaze that tore at Miriam's heart. She looked so small, so fragile in that moment, and it was all Miriam could do not to rush outside and try to help. The men exchanged a few words that Miriam couldn't hear, then shoved James and Amara toward the waiting car. Time seemed to slow as they were forced into the back seat, their captors moving with cold efficiency. Miriam's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She had to do something. But what? Her body felt paralyzed with fear, and for the first time in her life, she felt utterly helpless. Just as the car's engine roared to life, headlights cut through the darkness. A second car appeared at the end of the street, speeding toward the scene. Miriam's breath caught as she recognized the vehicle. Lila. She was here. The black sedan screeched to a halt just as the kidnapper's car began to pull away. Layla leaped from the driver's seat, her face a mask of determination, as she sprinted toward the garage. But she was too late. The car carrying James and Amara sped off into the night, leaving a trail of dust in its wake. Layla stood frozen for a moment, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The expression on her face was one of pure anguish, a look of someone who had arrived just a second too late. Miriam felt a lump rise in her throat as she watched the scene unfold, her own heart breaking for what had just happened. Layla turned and sprinted toward Miriam's house, her feet pounding against the pavement in desperation. Miriam quickly unlocked the door and let her in, her hands trembling as she stepped aside to let the younger woman pass. Layla was out of breath, her chest heaving with exhaustion and panic as she collapsed into one of Miriam's chairs. "They took them," Miriam whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "They took James and Amara." Layla nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "I know," she gasped. "I tried to stop them, but I was too late." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation hung in the air, thick and oppressive. Miriam felt tears well up in her eyes, a mixture of frustration and fear consuming her. What could they do now? How could they possibly find James and Amara before it was too late? Layla finally broke the silence. "We need to move fast. There's a safe house James set up for emergencies, but we have to find a way to get to them before they do." Miriam's brow furrowed. "A safe house? You mean he planned for this?" Layla nodded. "He knew this day would come eventually. That's why he's been so secretive, why he's kept Amara hidden. He's been preparing for the worst, but now we're running out of time. We need to find out where they're taking him." Miriam's mind raced. "How? They're gone. We don't know where they're headed." Layla bit her lip, her face filled with resolve. "I have a contact. Someone who's been helping James with information. He might be able to track the car, but it's risky. We're dealing with powerful people. We have to be smart about this." Miriam's fear mixed with a surge of adrenaline. "Whatever we have to do, let's do it." Layla glanced at her, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "Are you sure? This could get dangerous. They'll stop at nothing to get what they want." Miriam nodded, her expression firm. "I'm sure. I've watched this from the sidelines long enough. Amara, she needs us. We can't let her fall back into the hands of those men." Layla smiled faintly, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Thank you. I knew we could count on you." Without wasting another moment, Layla pulled out her phone and made a call. Miriam listened as Layla spoke in hushed tones, giving her contact the details of the situation and pleading for help. After what felt like an eternity, Layla hung up and turned to Miriam. "They're going to track the car," Layla said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "But we have to be ready. This won't be easy. Once we find them, we'll only have one shot." Miriam's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment of truth. They were about to embark on a dangerous mission to save James and Amara, and there was no turning back. As they prepared to leave, Miriam couldn't shake the image of Amara's terrified face, her small hand clutching at the hem of her yellow dress as she was forced into that car. They had to find her. They had to save her, and Miriam knew she would do whatever it took to make sure they did. The hunt begins, 1,500 words. The quiet of Maple Street had returned, but the tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Miriam and Layla stood in the dimly lit living room, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them. Miriam's heart thudded in her chest as the gravity of the situation sank deeper. James and Amara were out there, alone with dangerous men, and the clock was ticking. Layla's phone buzzed, breaking the silence. She answered quickly, her voice calm but urgent. Miriam couldn't make out the conversation, but the look on Layla's face was enough to tell her that something had been set in motion. When Layla hung up, her expression was grim but focused. "We've got a lead," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "The car was picked up by traffic cameras about 10 miles from here. It's heading toward the industrial district, on the outskirts of the city. That's where they'll be taking them." Miriam felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The industrial district was a sprawling maze of abandoned warehouses, old factories, and desolate streets that stretched for miles. It was the perfect place to hide someone. Or worse, do something terrible without anyone noticing. She had heard stories of criminals using those areas for all kinds of illicit activities. The thought of James and Amara being held in such a place sent a chill down her spine. "How long do we have?" Miriam asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Layla checked her watch. "Not long. If we move quickly, we might be able to intercept them before they disappear for good." Miriam nodded, a sense of resolve hardening within her. She had spent weeks watching from her window, consumed by curiosity and suspicion, but now everything was clear. This wasn't just a neighborhood mystery. It was a fight for survival, and Amara's life was hanging in the balance. She wasn't going to sit idly by any longer. "I'll go with you," Miriam said, her voice firm. Layla hesitated, her brow furrowing. "Mrs. Watson, this could be dangerous. We don't know how many men are involved, or what they're capable of. I can't ask you to put yourself at risk." Miriam shook her head, determination burning in her eyes. "You're not asking. I'm offering. I've watched that girl every night from my window, wondering what kind of life she was living, what kind of secrets James was hiding. Now I know the truth, and I'm not going to sit here while they're in danger. I may be old, but I'm not helpless. If there's anything I can do, I'm going to do it." Layla studied Miriam for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but we need to be smart about this. We can't just charge in there. My contact is tracking the car, and we'll have a better idea of where they're headed soon. But once we get there, we'll have to act fast." Miriam quickly gathered her things, a coat, her phone, and a small flashlight she kept for emergencies. As she tucked the flashlight into her pocket, she realized just how real this situation had become. It wasn't a movie or a story from a book club discussion. This was happening now, and people she cared about were in real danger. Within minutes, they were in Layla's car, speeding down the darkened streets of the city. The familiar landscape of quiet suburban homes quickly gave way to the cold, industrial sprawl of the outskirts. The air grew heavier, the streets lined with the skeletons of long-abandoned factories and warehouses. The distant hum of machinery could be heard in the background, but the area was mostly deserted at this time of night. Layla kept her eyes on the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Miriam sat in the passenger seat, the weight of their mission pressing down on her like a lead blanket. She couldn't stop thinking about Amara, the girl's wide, terrified eyes, the way she had clung to James in the brief moment Miriam had seen her before they were forced into the car. She had been so silent, so still, and it broke Miriam's heart to imagine what she must be feeling right now. Layla's phone buzzed again, and she quickly glanced at the screen before speaking. "They've stopped," Layla said, her voice tense. "About 3 blocks from here. We're close." Miriam's heart raced as they approached the location. The streets grew narrower, the buildings taller and more foreboding. Streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the pavement. The car slowed as Layla turned down a side street, coming to a stop in front of an old, abandoned warehouse. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades, the windows shattered, and the walls covered in graffiti. The perfect place to hide something, or someone, away from prying eyes. "This is it," Layla said, her voice barely above a whisper. They both got out of the car, moving quietly toward the building. Miriam's pulse quickened with each step, the sense of danger looming larger with every passing moment. Her flashlight remained tucked in her pocket. The last thing they needed was to draw attention to themselves too early. Layla led the way, her movements swift and purposeful. She seemed to know this world well, a world of danger, secrecy, and constant vigilance. Miriam couldn't help but feel out of place in this grim setting, but there was no turning back now. They approached a side entrance to the warehouse, its rusted door hanging slightly ajar. Layla pressed her finger to her lips, signaling for silence, then carefully pushed the door open. The creaking of the hinges echoed through the stillness, but there was no immediate sign that anyone had heard them. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, with only a few scattered lights casting faint pools of illumination across the vast, empty space. Miriam's heart pounded in her chest as they stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of oil. Broken machinery and old crates littered the floor, casting long shadows across the walls. It was the kind of place where secrets could easily be buried. They moved cautiously through the space, sticking to the shadows as they searched for any sign of James or Amara. Miriam's eyes darted around, taking in every detail. The warehouse was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of machinery somewhere in the background. It felt like a place suspended in time, forgotten by the rest of the world. Then, faintly, Miriam heard it. The sound of muffled voices coming from a room in the far corner of the warehouse. She grabbed Layla's arm, her pulse quickening. Layla nodded, understanding immediately. They crept closer, moving silently toward the source of the voices. As they neared the room, the voices grew clearer. Miriam could hear the low rumble of a man's voice, followed by what sounded like James. His voice strained, as if he were trying to reason with his captors. But the tone of the conversation was tense, filled with an undercurrent of threat. Layla motioned for Miriam to stay back as they approached the door. She pressed her ear against the cracked wood, listening for a moment before slowly inching the door open. Inside, Miriam could see James, his hands still bound, sitting in a chair near the center of the room. His face was battered, but he was alive. And standing next to him, clutching his arm, was Amara. Her small frame trembled with fear, but her expression was one of quiet resolve. She was trying to be brave, for herself and for James. Miriam's heart swelled with both relief and dread. They had found them, but now came the hardest part, getting them out. The 2 men who had taken James and Amara were pacing around the room, speaking in low voices. One of them was tall and wiry, with a cruel smile that never seemed to leave his face. The other was stockier, his posture rigid, like someone accustomed to giving orders. They were clearly dangerous, and whatever plan they had for James and Amara wasn't good. Layla turned to Miriam, her voice barely a whisper. "We have to create a distraction. I'll draw them away, and you get James and Amara out." Miriam's stomach twisted with anxiety, but she nodded. This was their only chance. Layla took a deep breath and slipped through the door, her movements quick and quiet. Miriam watched as she made her way toward the far side of the room, her presence unnoticed by the men, who were still focused on James. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the far corner of the warehouse. Lila had knocked over a stack of crates, sending a cascade of metal and wood clattering to the floor. The noise echoed through the building, drawing the men's attention immediately. "What the hell?" one of them barked, his eyes narrowing as he moved toward the source of the noise. The other man followed, his hand reaching for the gun at his side as they rushed toward the disturbance. Miriam knew this was her moment. She slipped into the room, her heart pounding in her chest as she rushed to James and Amara's side. "Come on," she whispered urgently, her hands fumbling with the rope that bound James's wrists. "We have to go now." James looked up at her, his eyes filled with both surprise and gratitude. "Miriam," he breathed, his voice strained. "How did you—" "There's no time," she interrupted, freeing him from the ropes. "We have to move." Amara looked up at Miriam, her wide eyes filled with fear, but also a flicker of hope. Miriam smiled down at her, trying to offer comfort in the midst of the chaos. "Don't worry, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're going to get you out of here." Together, they hurried toward the door, but just as they reached it, a shadow loomed over them. One of the men had returned, his gun raised, his eyes filled with cold intent. Miriam's breath caught in her throat. They were too late. Time seemed to freeze as Miriam, James, and Amara stood frozen in the doorway, staring down the barrel of the gun aimed directly at them. The man holding the weapon was tall and wiry, his eyes narrowed with cold, calculating malice. He stepped forward, blocking their path, his finger hovering over the trigger as if daring them to make a move. Well, he sneered, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Thought you could slip away, huh? You've made this far more complicated than it needed to be." Miriam's pulse pounded in her ears, her hands trembling as she instinctively moved to shield Amara, positioning her body in front of the young girl. She could feel the rapid thudding of the child's heartbeat against her back, and a fierce protective instinct surged within her. She wasn't going to let anything happen to Amara, not after everything they had been through. James, still battered and bruised, slowly straightened, his jaw clenched in defiance. "Let her go," he said, his voice rough but firm. "This is between you and me. Amara has nothing to do with this." The man chuckled darkly, his gun still trained on them. "Oh, she has everything to do with this. Do you think we've been chasing you for months just for fun? You have something that doesn't belong to you, Harrow." James's fists clenched at his sides, and Miriam could see the strain in his face as he tried to keep his emotions in check. His eyes flicked toward the man's partner, who was still rummaging through the far side of the warehouse, distracted by the noise Lila had created. But it wouldn't be long before both men were back, and their window of opportunity would slam shut. Miriam's mind raced, searching for some way out of this situation. Lila had bought them precious minutes with her diversion, but now they were cornered. The sound of the gunman's mocking laugh filled the air, and every second that passed felt like an eternity. She glanced at James, who was subtly shifting his weight, ready to act. But any sudden move could spell disaster. "You think you're clever, don't you?" the man taunted, taking a step closer. "But you're out of time, Harrow. There's no running now." As the man moved in, Miriam noticed something. Just a few feet away, lying abandoned in a pile of debris, was an old metal pipe, half covered in dust. It wasn't much, but it was something. Her heart raced as she calculated the distance. If she could grab it and create just enough of a distraction, maybe, just maybe, they could make a break for it. But the risk was immense. One wrong move, and the man would fire. Miriam's hands trembled as she considered the consequences, but her mind was made up. She wasn't going to stand by while Amara's life hung in the balance. In a swift, almost imperceptible motion, Miriam shifted her weight, reaching for the pipe with her free hand. Her fingers closed around the cold metal, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her, but there was no other choice. Before the gunman could react, Miriam swung the pipe with all the strength she could muster, aiming for his wrist. The metal connected with a sickening crack, and the man let out a startled yelp of pain as the gun flew from his hand, skittering across the concrete floor. "Run!" Miriam shouted, her voice filled with urgency as she grabbed Amara's hand and pulled her toward the door. James, quick to react, lunged at the gunman, using the element of surprise to his advantage. Though he was injured, the adrenaline coursing through his veins gave him the strength he needed to tackle the man to the ground, buying them precious moments. Miriam didn't hesitate. With Amara's small hand clutched tightly in hers, she sprinted toward the exit, her heart racing with every step. They had only seconds before the other man realized what was happening, and she wasn't going to waste them. But just as they reached the threshold of the door, the second man appeared, his face twisted with fury as he blocked their path. Miriam's blood ran cold. They were trapped. The man's eyes flicked toward his partner, who was now struggling with James on the ground, and then back to Miriam. His gaze hardened as he reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife, the blade glinting menacingly in the dim light. "You've made a big mistake, lady," he growled, advancing toward them with slow, deliberate steps. "No one gets out of here alive." Miriam's breath hitched, and she instinctively pushed Amara behind her, her mind racing. She wasn't fast enough to overpower him, and James was still locked in a desperate struggle with the first attacker. Layla was nowhere in sight, and every exit seemed blocked. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. There had to be a way out. The man lunged, his knife aimed directly at Miriam. But before he could reach her, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse, the sound of something heavy smashing into the wall behind him. The man turned just in time to see Layla charging toward him with a metal rod, her face a mask of determination. She swung the rod with brutal force, catching the man off guard as the weapon slammed into his shoulder, sending him sprawling to the ground. His knife clattered from his hand, and he let out a pained grunt as he struggled to regain his footing. "Go!" Layla shouted, her voice ringing with authority as she stood over the fallen man. "Get out of here." Miriam didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed Amara's hand once more and darted for the exit, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the struggle. The clatter of metal against concrete, the grunts of effort as Layla fought to keep the men at bay. They burst out into the night, the cold air hitting Miriam's face like a shock. But there was no time to catch her breath. They were still in danger. The warehouse was surrounded by narrow alleyways and darkened streets, and they needed to find cover fast. Miriam's mind raced as she pulled Amara toward a nearby alley, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of pursuit. But the streets were eerily silent, save for the distant hum of traffic. For a brief moment, it seemed as though they had escaped. "Miriam!" James's voice called from behind them, and she turned to see him stumbling out of the warehouse, bruised and battered but alive. Relief washed over her as he limped toward them, his eyes filled with exhaustion, but also gratitude. "We need to keep moving," James said, his voice hoarse. "They won't stay down for long." Miriam nodded, and together they made their way down the alley, the shadows swallowing them as they moved deeper into the maze of streets. Every step felt like an eternity, and Miriam's heart remained lodged in her throat. But the further they got from the warehouse, the safer they felt. After what felt like hours, they finally reached the outskirts of the industrial district, the desolation giving way to the faint glow of city lights in the distance. Miriam slowed her pace, her legs trembling with exhaustion. They had made it. For now, at least, they were safe. James collapsed onto a nearby bench, his chest heaving with the effort of breathing. Amara sat beside him, her small body still trembling, but she leaned against him for comfort. Miriam stood close, her eyes scanning the streets for any sign of danger, but there was none. The men hadn't followed them, not yet, anyway. Layla arrived moments later, her face streaked with sweat and her clothes disheveled. She had clearly been in a fight, but she was unhurt. "They won't be down for long," Lila said, her voice strained. "But we bought ourselves some time. We need to get you both to the safe house. It's the only place they won't be able to find you." James nodded, his face grim. "I never wanted to drag you into this," he said, looking at Miriam with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. "But you saved us, both of you." Miriam smiled faintly, though the weight of everything they had been through still pressed down on her. "You have done the same for me," she replied softly. Amara looked up at Miriam, her eyes filled with a quiet strength that belied her young age. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice small but sincere. Miriam knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's face. "You're safe now, sweetheart. We'll make sure of it." As they prepared to leave, the full scope of what they had endured settled over them like a heavy blanket. But despite the fear, despite the danger that still loomed on the horizon, there was a sense of hope. They had survived the night. They had fought back against the shadows that had threatened to swallow them whole. And as Miriam stood with James and Amara, watching the first light of dawn break over the horizon, she knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together.